Okay, so we have a quorum here. You agree? We have a quorum?
Yeah, we
Okay.
do.
So first item is to approve minutes from our June 13th, 22 meeting, and those were circulated last week by Catherine. Are there any amendments to it?
Hard copy, anyway.
Hearing none, we can just place that on file, right? Okay. So we don't have the luxury at this moment of projecting the PowerPoint that Nick, Artie, and I worked on this week, past few weeks. But what we have is a project plan, a high-level project plan that we've developed. We've shared it with Marianne and Kevin for feedback as well. And the goal of the deck was to lay out what that project plan would be and then bring that to a chairs meeting in August. Paul, do you mind if I borrow your computer?
Yeah, you know, I'm trying to transfer to this stick.
Yep.
For their purposes, and for some reason it won't open. I'm trying.
Oh, it won't over there. Where's your file? The file explorer. Just the view of the cursed file.
So I can do it.
It's your list of files.
For some reason, it's still
Okay.
there, right?
Oh, yes, this guy. So,
Maybe that's it.
and where's the disk? This
It's
guy.
in here.
It's called.
No, but it's probably,
Not there.
Why don't we punt and I'll just walk everybody through it. And I'll try to turn it your way so you can see it on a tiny screen. So what the activity that Nick, Marty, and I went through was we looked at the slide deck that we shared last time, the one that was from Wellesley, and thought, well, what would our version of this deck look like? With the intent of first bringing this to the chairs meeting, the Marianne, and then Marcus and Kate in August to get their feedback on it. And then the second key audience would be to bring this to other select board, other boards, committees that are relevant to climate action plan, as well as potentially other department heads who might be involved in the process at some point. And the goal is to lay out the process. So I'll just click through it for you. Actually, I'll go into presentation mode so it's a little bit easier to see. So it's a draft. This is not final. This will certainly be something that we can all provide feedback on before we bring it to the chairs. But it starts with our sources of greenhouse gases. So this is based on the greenhouse gas report that Nick walked us through in an earlier meeting. It shows the key sources. The key takeaways for the town is that this little slice down here, that's all that's under the direct control of the town of Needham. Very small slice of it. And so the rest of it, as we know, is in transportation, buildings, electricity generation, construction, et cetera. All of this is controlled by private residents, businesses, organizations, companies, et cetera. And so the key takeaway of the slide is it's going to take everybody in Needham in order to reduce our greenhouse gases to zero. We want to make sure we convey that message to every stakeholder that we talk to. We also want to remind people of all of our successes. So thanks to the good work of Andy and Hank and Nick and others, we've got a great list of all of the achievements that have happened. So the top goes through some of the key milestones like the RTS solar arrays, becoming a green community, our solarized Needham. We've done 2 rounds, have added the 650 installations that we have on residential houses, but that's a key data point that I think people should know. That's a decent starting point if we're thinking about electricity generation. And then things like the PSAB ground source heat pumps, the electricity, EV chargers that are at a number of locations throughout town. So this is to just convey the message to those who may not be aware of it, that Needham's actually been already in this game for quite a while and successful. Then we talked about the goal, right? And so this is a graphic that comes from one of the MAPC documents on climate action plans. Our goal is net zero by 2050, which really is more like 85% below the 1990 baseline, I believe is what the state is. So this is to tell the goal. And so then we shift into process. So how do we get there? And as we've talked in earlier meetings, the output of this group is a climate action plan, but a document that doesn't have buy-in from all of those stakeholders is possibly just a piece of paper, right? So we want to make sure that our process is inclusive and it draws in all the stakeholders that we need in order to be successful when we move to implementation. And so we start with our town select board, and there's a review process that we're anticipating taking this step to and getting some early heads up. So I think like a 10 minutes at the planning board or 10 minutes at PSAB. Here's what we're doing. Here's our timeline. Here's what we hope to accomplish. Do you have any feedback, any concerns, things of that nature? So that's the first piece. And during that, as we talked about with Wellesley, there's also the opportunity for some of those boards to say, hey, you should talk to this person who's really interested in this, has some great expertise. So we can start to make our list of potential ads for the second phase, which is the working groups. And so the working groups are where a lot of the work gets done. So we've sort of organized ourselves now. Now we're putting together a plan. This fall will be the working groups. And the goal of the working groups is to give us the breadth. So we've already kind of gone through an activity where we looked at other towns, but maybe there's other sources that we should have considered that we didn't include. And the working groups will be responsible for finding that. They'll also be helping us to get a little bit deeper understanding on those specific actions, specifically on the level of effort to implement. So they might need to talk to people in town or talk to other towns about, well, how hard was it to do a CEA, or how hard was it to pass a special? Who needs to be involved in that for that to be successful? So we're hoping that we get the deeper analysis in there. Also currency, I think, is the other one. So we've looked at some towns' climate action plans and some of their ideas, but the landscape shifts. So, towns 3 years ago were saying, well, we're going to pass electric only heat ordinances. Well, that's been shut down by the state. We probably don't want to put that on our action plans now, right? So we want to make sure that we're really current when the recommendations come out. And then community engagement is key as well, right? So even though these are sort of like sequential, think of them as more like spiraling. As we get more information, we can share it with the community, we can invite feedback, we can inject that back into the working groups, and hopefully that will create a better product at the end that everybody's excited about. And so then our final output is that climate action plan. And that action plan can then be socialized back to those boards, back to those individuals on different departments. And then as necessary, where there weren't articles, we go to town meeting. There might be some involvement in this committee in helping to draft those warrant articles, or at least identifying which ones should be prioritized in what years. Because we're not going to do everything in 1 year, right?
So Stephen,
Yeah.
one question I have, and that is, I mean, obviously this process can't be done by 30,000 people,
Right.
Sitting in and putting in everyone saying exactly how it should be. At the same time, it's nice how that people can actually see what's going on along the way, so they feel as though they are some aspect of the process.
Right.
Because I think we can all understand that, we are working in the best interest of the town, best interest of the people, and that's a fact. It doesn't always come across that way. It just simply doesn't always come across that way. And sometimes what happens is you get to the point where when there's really a presentation, I'm not sure exactly where it's going to be, where our thinking process is right now, but it's really a presentation, and it comes across as something where Yes, you're asking us, but it's kind of like more like, this is what you want. It's kind of like a final type of thing. But yeah, you see, you want our input, but you, at the same time, you want to do what you want to do. So the question I have is, at what point can we have at least viewability by the public? And they can send in comments as necessary. So viewability from the public, so they can see the process going along.
So if you can hold that in our second agenda item today, we're talking about the engagement model discussion. So from 7 to 7:20, I think those are some of the questions I was teeing up. Who
Yeah,
should we involve, when,
Sure. Oh, yeah, let's just
how,
save it.
why?
Yeah, let's just save it. Yeah.
To a degree, by presenting in front of boards in public session, we're starting that
Yeah,
process.
if in, that's the key, if they are in fact public sessions.
Oh, they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, public meetings requires us to.
Yeah, well, I mean, if public meetings and they're advertised as public meetings, here's what's going on. But we can say,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, no, I think it's an important point, Artie. That's why we definitely want to talk about it at length today. So I think we need to define what our cadence is going to be.
Yeah.
So that's the high level process. This is a graphic that talks about the different sources of greenhouse gas reductions. So we have, sorry, I'm going to put my glasses on because I can't read from an angle. So zero emissions mobility, net zero buildings, clean energy supply, and then climate smart zoning and permitting. So this comes from the MAPC toolkit, which is another source of ideas and actions that I don't think we've plumbed quite as deep as we could. But it's really just to kind of help people understand the big buckets that we're going to be working on. There are more buckets than these four. In fact, we'll talk about it in the working groups. But these four give us a starting point. So this side goes in, how are we going to prioritize actions? And it talks about the working groups. So there are 6. So 4 of them are ones on the previous slide, the zero emissions transportation, net zero buildings, clean energy supply, and then the climate smart zoning and permitting. And then there's natural resources, zero waste. So thinking about our environment, and then governance. And so each of those could be a set of actions that comes out from the different working groups. And the assumption is the working groups will evaluate the menu of potential actions, and then they'll mine other towns' climate action plans. They'll mine the MAPC toolkit as well as other sources of actions. And then the idea is that those working groups will compare the anticipated impact of those actions on the greenhouse gas reduction potential for the town of Needham. And that will help us prioritize the specific actions that we want to recommend. So going back to our charge, one of the key deliverables was to have a climate action plan that defines what our goals are by decade, with a focus on the next decade. So what are we going to do in the next 5 to 10 years that will have the biggest impact? And then what does the following decade potentially look like? With declining level of detail, it gets more speculative further out the detail.
But we're going to talk more about working groups later. Right?
We are, yeah. So I think the working groups piece, we're probably going to have to define what's the output look like, what's the process, who's going to lead the efforts in each working group, et cetera. So those 6 working groups, and then what I've done here is I've just grouped some of the actions that we've already collected along the way as examples. So somebody who is new to this process understands what we mean by, for example, natural resources and zero waste. Well, tree preservation would be, for example, in that bucket. So with potentially looking at our wetlands and expanding our wetlands, or passing bylaws for impervious surfaces, let the water go through, et cetera, instead of running off. So this is again an example. Think about somebody who's not gone through any of these activities. So our proposed timeline is here. It is ambitious. We're here in July. We drafted the climate action plan outline. Actually, Nick and Andy have started working on a document from that started from Wellesley to give us just an outline. So if somebody wants to know what the structure of a climate action plan meeting might look like, we'll have a artifact, and then our draft project plan. Then the goal in August is to essentially agree to the project plan with the select board and town manager. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
I don't have my charger, and I don't know how much, I'm low on battery, so I think I can make it through your presentation.
Thank you.
I don't know if I can do the Zoom at the same time.
Yeah, so we're almost done. We're in good shape. So I'm gonna just read off this because I can do this easier than that.
These are some computers.
And so August, we did talk with Mary Ann briefly, and so she thinks that August is the right time frame for going back to the chairs. That also keeps us on our at least twice a year cadence reporting back to the select board. And then and our town manager will be there as well. So if there's an ask, for example, meet with other staff in town, we'll clear that with Kate first. And so we talked about August developing the overview presentations for the boards and other staff. We've got the template here, but we could envision doing some tailoring of it. For example, if we're meeting with the PSAB, what would be more relevant to PSAB as opposed to meeting with the planning board or meeting with another committee. And then the other thing we have to do in August, as the select board starts to work towards a warrant, is to finalize our ask for town meeting. So specifically, I think Kate mentioned if there's a monetary ask of town meeting, we need to have it well defined and delivered by August so that it can get into a warrant article. And we talked a little bit about some ideas. We have some time on the agenda today to go more deeply, so I won't jump to that right now. So then, sorry, there's a question?
Soon,
Yes,
so they want a number.
they want a number. They want a number and a specific
Scope,
scope.
purpose.
Yeah.
Right.
So what is the date you're looking at the chairs meeting? And is
We
Kate
don't have
there?
that, we don't have that set yet, so.
Is that
Mary
coming
and I-
from
Sorry,
Mary Ann?
Mary Ann would have, and I think she said she's got some dates set aside specifically for these types of meetings in August. So while she's not here today, she asked us to follow up with her after the meeting, depending on the outcome of this discussion.
Yeah, and regarding the talking to other town departments, there is the DRT meeting that is scheduled now for the 26th of July.
Right.
And I think that presenting, and that was mainly going to be a presentation by the MAPC folks.
Right.
But I think this, if one of you could,
I'll be on.
yeah, so if you could make this presentation to them to give the broader aspect, because MAPC is only talking about that thin sliver, which relates to the town. And this is important to broaden that discussion. I would expect that ask during that meeting is to begin to identify potential department heads that would be needed to participate in those other groups.
Right.
The pushback you're going to hear is that everybody is incredibly busy.
Yeah.
And I think that your schedule is aggressive. And perhaps it might even take another year to get through the process.
Awesome.
I think that's what you're going to hear, particularly in terms of broadening the final plan and buy-in. But that'll come out of the chair's discussion and others. I don't know how to. There hasn't been a referendum on whether a climate action plan is a good thing to do, and I'm not quite sure how the town meeting certainly would be an important step in the process. And I think that the more town meeting members that we can engage in the subcommittees, the better. Because then you have a built-in network that they're supposed to be reporting back to their constituencies. And that's one vehicle. And then the other vehicle we talked about was setting up a town webpage that would enable that broadcasting of information to anybody who's interested. And we spoke with Cindy last time, and she's prepared to help on that.
That's great.
So this is great. It's a great start, but Nick, if you can use that at the DRT meeting.
Yeah, and I think maybe emphasizing that this is, we're looking for, we're not coming to the department heads right now with an ask, but we're looking to make it an interactive process and acknowledging that it's an aggressive timeline.
Yeah.
And I think we knew that in putting this together.
Yeah.
We figured,
And acknowledging that we're one of the few towns in this area that have not done a climate action plan to this point.
Yeah.
So we are behind other
Yeah.
towns and catch up.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to, if we can provide the incentive to pushing forward with an aggressive timeline.
Yeah.
We may not get what we want, but I think we can still.
Start in that direction.
This energy has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think it's from us.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I'm not resisting it. I'm just
Anticipating.
anticipating.
The reality of the situation.
I think that underscores the importance of being very specific about the ask as well. Right? So to your point, the energy does have to come here. And when I spoke with Mary Beth Martello and Wellesley, he said that it was primarily the chair of the working group, which is a member of the climate action committee there, that was doing most of the heavy lifting on those working groups. And so we can talk more about like how we want to organize and work together, but especially the town staff, we should be very, very conservative about what time we're asking them to put into this. I mean, they could be reviewers as opposed to researchers.
That's a key point.
Yes.
That's a very key point. Reviewers versus the ones doing the research. Here, we've done this for you. Here's a lot of valid information. Please look at it.
and particularly keeping in mind that the town, town is 5% of the greenhouse gases. We're looking to leverage it because the town has a lot of leverage, but so we're coming to the department heads as experts and saying, who do we, who are your angels and your thorns that we should bring in and talk to
And
to help leverage this and get it.
right, and I don't know if they're referendums for the town meeting or how you poll town meeting members to see what the temperature is for this. I suppose the eventual vote for approval of the plan,
Well, I don't know that the town meeting approves the plan. Like
the select.
Yeah,
board.
yeah.
select board,
The select board.
select board approves the plan,
Okay,
and the select board, working with other town boards, committees, would bring specific articles to town meeting as
Got it.
needed.
okay.
So
Yeah, I think clarifying that process is helpful.
Well, like all things, I can imagine that most people in the town like, oh, yes, absolutely, without question, we have to do something. Then it's a matter of, well, what do you have to do and how much is it going to cost?
that's.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Or how
that's
much
what
it's
the
gonna
working groups
save
have
me.
to help define, this is people probably not gonna be able to give a real like estimate, but is it, a small, medium, large type project in terms of.
Where's the cost benefit of everything going?
Yeah. So, that's a great outline that you've put together.
So just to continue through the outline very quick, September would be the presentations to the boards and other department heads as necessary. That's the timeframe that I think we're probably forming the working groups. And the working groups, again, the idea would be probably each of us or most of us would be chairing one of those working groups in conjunction potentially with a town staff member, another town board member, who might be a co-chair. And then you have probably, 3 to 5 other individuals who are brought in because of their expertise or interest in that particular topic. And then we time box that to say, it's probably 2, maybe 3 months of work until an output is expected back to this committee. And so that's the October to December period. Beginning public outreach probably happens at that point. We start to have an idea of where we're heading. And then in December, January, that's the anticipated time for submitting the actions from the working groups. And then we begin drafting the climate action plan and reporting back to the select board again. And then at some point in spring, the goal is to try to finalize the climate action plan. And the other thing that's happening in spring, of course, is spring town meeting. So is there a specific ask for that town meeting? So think about plan 2050, but what are we going to be asking for in 2023 to help jumpstart the plan?
In the fall, coming 2022 is.
CEA, right? The CEA is probably the primary warrant article there. So that's the timeline. And then I won't go through this because you guys have all seen that. Oh, you should go to the next slide, Catherine. I'm sorry. This was just to share what we've already done. And I'm starting to rethink this a little bit because there's a lot of detail, and it also suggests that there's a level of research we did when we did this exercise that might not actually be correct. But I want to tell them, I want to give people a sense of how we would prioritize. And so it's impact on greenhouse gas emission versus level of effort to get there. If you go to the next slide, Catherine, if you'll see that we're just talking about those grids that we did, the exercise we did a couple months ago. So this might be too much detail. It also it suggests a level of accuracy that we don't really have. If you look at the distribution and scores for a lot of these, some people think they're ones, some people think they're fives.
Yeah.
The working group needs to pin that down.
I think actually it's a very good point that this is probably too much detail, particularly after what Artie was saying about you don't want people to think this is a done deal.
Right.
But these are the criteria, and particularly as we're talking to the department heads to say, we're weighing the amount of work, whether it's by town staff, boards, or citizens versus the impact. And that's really what we're.
Well, it's all, almost everything is on the presentation.
Yeah.
As far as how are you presenting it? I mean, there's facts, but you want the presentation to mirror the facts.
Right.
And the facts are, we don't know.
Right.
And
this
Those are
conveys-
the facts.
Yeah.
Those are the facts. We don't know right now. We're looking to gain knowledge to get to the point where we have a more certainty of everything going on and what we think is going to work.
So I
So
might
it's presentation.
distill these 6 slides down to 1 and have it be more conceptual, just to give people a sense of the framework as opposed to it being an output.
As a recommendation. And I think it's a good exercise for each subcommittee to go through.
Yeah.
And use that as a tool.
So that is the end of the presentation that we created, I should say. Do we want to go around for feedback on suggestions on how to improve it, anything that was missing, anything you found confusing?
I would say in slide 2, you articulate, the pie chart, the sliver versus the bulk of the pie. I think you articulate and presented it well, saying, look at where, I think you have to actually say that in the text, like, notice how big the pie is and how small the slice is. On how do we get there? I think the head was high-end process overview. Then you just say, how do we get there? Because that was like, just say, how do we get there? Yeah. And then the art for the timeline, I see it as a spiral. We start small, go up, and it just get bigger and
I
wider.
mean, the arrow.
Yeah, the arrow. Yeah, it's it's a different way. And I like the big buckets, the 4 big buckets. I found that so a football play that confusing. I see it was too like, I'm not sure why willing, but I get it, but
Yes, the last 11, from 11 to 15, could throw people off in terms of impact versus effort.
Those are the matrices.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so we'll have to condense that into, here's the concept, here's what we thought, here's what people had an idea of, but this is a group's opinion with some justification that this is what needs to be flushed out in the working group. So I don't think I would if you could condense those, that'd be terrific.
And make it more conceptual.
And that was one of the things, when I talked to a couple of town sustainability managers, the one thing they kept saying over and over again was that when they put their climate action plans together or whatever, as the plan was moving along and the consultants were doing a lot of this, the sort of face work for this, which is that the consultants offered this granular detail for these processes that their towns people couldn't absorb. And so they didn't do a good enough job of creating a executive summary or overview that the average person could absorb quickly to start with. And then if they wanted to go in more detail, then they could read the 21, recommendations that the consultants have made. And if you look at all the different consultants' recommendations, they're all very similar in the sense that they are extremely detailed. And probably most of and I read them because I like to read them, but our average citizen is just going to go like this. And that's my concern about the entire process. At the end, is that the action plan will be something that sits and the inspiration to act on it will get lost in the detail. So that's what a couple of the managers said that they actually ran into trouble with. So
What do you mean by, so I understand essentially what he's saying,
Yeah.
here's some plans, here's a detail of plans,
Yeah.
but he's saying the detail of plans is the pathway to getting lost. I wasn't sure what he meant by something's getting lost.
well, no, I think that the pathway, when the consultants create these action plans,
Mhm.
some of them are practical and low hanging fruit. And a lot of them describe these words as aspirational or visionary,
Mhm.
which means it's going to be really hard to do, right?
Sure, yeah.
But they include everything because that's what
Mhm.
consultants do, right?
Mhm. That's
And
their
so,
job.
and so the risk is that for the average citizen is that they get lost in the process. And my concerns, but I don't think we can do it. I think if we, with all these working groups, if we approach the people that we're going to engage with that big picture first,
Mhm.
then we won't lose them.
That's, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, without
But
question.
I'm afraid we'll lose them because they'll see it as daunting and people won't want to engage. But I think if we can bite it off carefully,
Mhm.
it's less likely to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of-
Go ahead.
But I mean, which gets me thinking, as we look at the mandate to look at decade by decade in the next 10 years, really, that's one way to break it out and make it
Yes.
more manageable, because we're saying to the working group on transportation, okay, let's look at our goals for the next 10 years. Let's look at this transitional period with buildings, or, what can we do? And that, so we're not, our eye is on 2050 or 2060, but we're not looking at magic.
Right.
And we're kind of keeping focus on the next 7 to 10 years.
Well, I know you know this.
No, this is great feedback, and actually, so you've actually identified one lens, the decades for chunking it down. We might also want to think about, in terms of engagement models, how do we chunk this down for specific subgroups of meeting? So what's the homeowners climate action plan look like for the next 50 years? Or what's the business owners climate action plan look like for the next 50 years? Or houses of worship,
Yeah, and some of that has kind of started to be broken out in some of the columns here,
Yeah.
where they're more specific to homeowners and so forth. Some
We
of
could do
some of it's
that,
kind of already there.
or we could create a separate article. It
Absolutely.
could be a
Oh, absolutely.
distilled,
Yeah.
very high level executive summary for the
Yeah.
homeowner. Here are the 5 things that you need to do in the next 25 years that'll get us there.
Oh, absolutely.
The danger of too much detail, like I said, is you don't not only lose people, but you allow opponents to tear this apart, as you will pull the strings out and all of a sudden you unravel it. Then you're having a conversation about something you didn't think that to have a conversation about.
What we're looking at is a pitch deck, really.
Yeah.
And so we have to keep it in that, particularly at this stage, we're pitching people on the idea of, here's why we need a climate action plan. And, the basic steps and the ask, like we said, to each committee or group may be slightly different, but
So I think we're sliding into our next topic a little bit on this, but before we do that, other feedback on the deck.
Actually, I wanted to say, Stephen, you were being way too items. I mean,
Oh, I think
my input on this was part of our meeting we had, me making a few comments. I did not, you guys put the work into
Provide
that.
feedback.
Yeah, you guys put the work into this. I just looked and said, that's beautiful, Steve. I love it.
You might have been recovering from surgery.
I might have been.
Rachel has a comment.
Yes.
Sure, yeah. I think such an important part of this process is going to be the work groups. And maybe it's an exercise more for us than a slide per se, but I think we have to be really clear about, I know you had a few bullets there. I would spend more time on that slide of what's the purpose of the work group? What are the outcomes? How will they work together? How will we identify people? I think there's going to be a lot of questions from the community of like, how did these get formed? Who's making these decisions? They're going to have a lot of influence and sort of into the ultimate product that we're creating of the action plan. So I think more detail there. And that might mean that as a team, we have to think about what are our expectations and how do we measure progress? And then speaking of measuring progress, I think we're really light still. I know we have our pie chart, but we're really light on data. And not to overwhelm, to the earlier point, we don't need to bog people down too much into the details, but we've got to be really clear about what are we measuring, and part of the communications have to be around, this is where we are, this is where we plan to go, this is how we think we're going to get there, and just use more data. And it sounds, and I didn't see that in our plan there, but I know that's something we've talked about at previous meetings of like, how are we going to actually get that next level down? I know we did some exercises a couple of years ago, but where is that in the plan to kind of really, commit and make an investment there? Is that in governance? I don't know.
True. We talked about how many other towns have created climate action plans. It would not be a horrible thing, if a bit shameful, at the beginning to say, this is a state approach, and here are some of the towns, and we list all 40 of them. So, we're not like doing something that is outlandish.
Yeah.
It's not out of the ordinary. Others have done this, and they've been actually doing it for years, and neither needs to enter into that same engagement.
We took that tack with the green communities too.
It didn't work.
No, we did. We
Eventually.
showed this map of
Eventually.
eastern Massachusetts, and Needham was this white
Yeah.
spot. Needham and Haverhill, I think, were the.
Yeah.
We're not that far.
Not something to be proud of.
Just like all day kindergarten, right?
Well, no, I think that other towns
Curbside pickup.
with more, with a different population and frankly, not the similar resources, have undertaken this.
Yeah.
And so I think making that point,
Dispelling.
As well as our peer towns.
yes, of course.
Rachel, do you have any other comments? I'm sorry.
Nope, she's shaking her head.
She's shaking her head. Okay, thank you. Hank, did you have any others?
No, I think all of these comments are good. I don't know exactly how you'll craft it into a short summary slideshow, but I know you can do it.
Thank you. Catherine or Cecilia?
I do want to mention that Wellesley, I think, has a 2-pager.
Yes.
And if we can boil this down to a 2-pager, that's the executive summary that
Yeah.
we're talking about.
Yeah, they do.
Andy, do you have any feedback? All right. So the one last thing it would be good to maybe not decide, but if anybody has a working group that they'd be very interested in sharing, I'd be happy to take those names at this point. Paul, do you have any that you're thinking on?
So I guess the only one I don't think I could do would be the governance one, but the other ones, I've got them all listed here. Where are they? 0 emission, so transportation or buildings or clean energy supply, or any of those would be fine.
Rachel, since you're online, I don't want you to be last.
No, that's fine. You pick one that no one is interested in, and I'll dig in there. It's fine. I'll do it. I don't have a particular technical expertise in any of them, so I can help organize a working group for sure.
She did say governance,
It was
yes.
actually,
Is that what I'm saying? All right.
Rachel, I think that's actually one of the most important ones.
It is the most important.
Well, it also speaks to the issue of getting the word out and communication.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I can work on that one.
One I should maybe stay away from just for conflict of interest is maybe the clean energy supply, if the residential solar is part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I should probably stay away from that. I'm good on whether it be the net zero buildings, commercial, the climate smart, or the natural. I like the natural resources one. That resonates with me. At the same time, building efficiency greatly resonates with me as well.
Great.
Is a BTU not spent is the BTU
Yeah.
saved.
Who am I missing? Nick.
I'd be willing to do clean energy supply or maybe buildings, but I think stick with the supply.
Okay. Joe has an expertise in buildings.
Joe and Natasha both have expertise in buildings.
There you
And
go.
Natasha's on the planning.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
She could do zoning.
She would do zoning.
Yeah.
And then Joe could do buildings. That's actually a pretty good distribution right there.
Do we have natural resources, zero waste?
Natural zero.
I really, that resonates with me a lot.
Yeah, I think that's a,
I'm happy to do whatever's left, transportation or
I think transportation would go to. You have an EV?
driving around in my Volt.
I was gonna make sure you can't take transportation unless you're driving.
Bicycle, yeah, bicycle.
I was not gonna let Nick have that one.
Even better.
All right, so I think we've got a good mix there.
Could
So
you,
what
could
we
you
can
just
probably do is-
read through those again?
Yeah, so here we go. Paul for transportation, EV transportation.
Yeah.
Rachel for governance.
Yeah.
Artie for natural resources and zero waste. Joe for building. Natasha for the smart zoning. And Nick for clean energy supply. And Rachel, I'm happy to help you on the governance piece.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense.
Good, all right, so that's good. So I think maybe our next meeting, I think will hopefully happen just after meeting with the chairs. We'll have some feedback on whether or not this overall plan meets their expectations.
So you'll just be meeting.
Yeah, just the two of us with Marianne and Marcus and Kate, I think would be the group that would be meeting.
Yeah, often liaisons are invited to those, but it's not
Okay.
necessary.
Good, all right. Feel free to join.
Okay.
The one just so like how I think we're going to communicate this to Marianne that we're ready to bring this forward. We have from our last meeting an action that we took to communicate what the recommendations of this committee were for goals, for the select board goals, and we were supposed to write that up. It was a formal memo, so we'll write that. Nick and I have actually started drafting that. We'll send that over to the chairs and at the same time request the chairs meeting for an update. So hopefully we'll try to schedule that for before our next meeting, which I can't recall what the exact date is.
Oh, is that,
The next meeting is the 15th of August.
15th of August.
should we be getting that memo in before the select board retreat? Is that the-
Yes.
Yes.
So we should get the memo in
August 3rd, so we should get it in.
ASAP, but then plan the meeting
Right.
first week or second week of August before our next.
Where's the August 15th meeting? PSAB?
He said.
So, so what that would hopefully give us is the opportunity to dive deeper into the working group. What specifically how we want to organize them. The questions Rachel, I think, just brought up and articulated quite well. You know, how are they going to work? How are they going to be formed? What's the output going to look like? Are there templates we need to provide so everybody generates similar similar artifacts at the end. Good. So we're right on time. So next topic, unless there's any final comments about the proposed process.
I guess what I would ask each of the subcommittee chairs is who within the town departments would be the appropriate person that you'd want to engage. And that would be perhaps an ask, Nick, at the DRT meeting. Say, we have these and maybe there's, you could add to that.
You can add to that slide.
Yeah, and this was the example that Andy found for Wellesley.
Yes,
And what-
this is the list of their working groups.
Yeah, so what you might be able to do is to strip this down and start rebuilding. But instead of putting names in, you put in titles.
We have that, I saw that somewhere.
That was just added to the SharePoint.
It's in the SharePoint.
Yeah.
Thank you for putting that together.
The elusive SharePoint, but yes, it's in there, it's all right.
Who, just show of hands, who does not have the link handy for SharePoint? We should maybe just resend it out again.
I can resend it.
I find that once I started using it regularly, I was like, oh, now I know where it is, and I bookmarked it. Yeah, so in addition to town staff, if you could be thinking about more broadly, what other stakeholders in town we think we might need to have engaged. So for example, buildings, do we need somebody from Olin?
You definitely want them. And I think for energy, because one of their specialties is electricity.
Yeah.
And so you want them on you want somebody, a very smart professor, and maybe some students. And who knows, maybe a professor could take it on as a class study project as well.
Similarly, in the zoning, we might have some questions with developers or building owners that we want to.
Do we know if the Needham Community Council is connected with food rescue? Do they have any connection with food rescue?
I haven't heard anything on food rescue through them.
Okay.
There are other organizations that have it.
That do it, yeah.
At one point, there was
Even the Boston Food Bank,
Discussion,
even
yeah.
Boston Food Bank did food rescue.
I think there's been discussion of food rescue at places like Olin. I don't know if they did it in the public schools here.
Okay.
About it.
Just curious.
They composting, food waste,
The
reducing.
The
food
public schools have a composting plan for some of the schools. Not all the schools are participating, but COVID really threw that into a loop.
But yeah, I
They
think
have an
already,
organics recycling program that just got started the last few months of this school year.
yeah, I think those are the types of things.
Okay, no, that's fine. Just curious.
Zero waste.
Yeah,
And
zero
by the
waste.
way, we can connect you with people as well through Greenie.
Yeah, that's good.
What were the size of these working groups, or at least in terms of the number of?
Do you have the count there, roughly? But roughly like, I want to say like 7 to 10.
They had anywhere from, the largest one looks like was 17 or 18.
Okay, good margin.
The smallest one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But they listed a Wellesley student, Wellesley sustainable member, so from the college. So I suspect a lot of the institutions, like the houses of worship, probably most of them, or at least some of them, have a sustainability committee or goals or something like that.
Right. Group, I don't know how active they are.
Pretty active.
Yeah, I would think reaching out to them, getting some of them on the committee, because you really want people on the committee who are then broadcasting the message elsewhere. And that's where I go back to town meeting members, because they have a responsibility to certain members, to their constituencies. I hope that
That would help.
that would help, and maybe there can be, local other meetings that they set up. I don't know how the town meeting members work with their constituents, if they have,
They actually just got an email system set up for them.
Oh, we did?
Yeah. And it's sort of a blind system, so.
But that might be, once we talked about engagement model, we might want to start to think about, well, how do we maybe use that email system to communicate what we're up to,
Yeah.
where we are in the process,
Right.
what help we might need, what, feedback we might want them to provide us. There's a pretty active Facebook group as well. Doesn't include all the town meeting members, but it's,
But it's also, it works both ways. You can also just talk to everyone you know in groups and say, write here and contact your town meeting members, and that will activate them too. That's
Yeah.
Which we did that with the stretch code. I think that was the town meeting. But we did some outreach.
okay, so 10 to 15 or so, 10 to 17 in terms of membership. So start thinking about at least titles and classes of people that you want to bring on board. But don't send out anything until we get the select board
right.
failure and town meeting in Kate's approval. We'll hold that off for our next discussion. So for the next 15, 20 minutes, we have on our agenda talking about the engagement. So we've already talked a little bit about getting in front of the select board chairs and a little bit about who we want to draw into the process. But I'm curious, Rachel, you brought this up a little bit. And I know that you talked about working with Cindy about some of our engagement, external engagement. Have you any thoughts in terms of how we should organize this structure? I was thinking we could have this as a little bit more of a brainstorming session. I don't think you have a plan at this point.
I don't have a plan. So Cindy and I are meeting next week. So unfortunately we couldn't do it before this call. We do have we do have a website. I don't know if you've seen it. It's really basic. It just has our goals. It has our names. I think, just in the spirit of brainstorming at this point, I'm not sure yet what the structure of this will look like, but we'll definitely want to map this out. I think there's a few things other towns have done. For example, like we should have an email address to our team so that people can submit questions or feedback. And whether that's a form or an email address, whatever that the case may be, I think we need to be reachable as a working group. And Cindy has kind of a list, and I'll share that next time. She has a list of kind of all the ways that the town shares information. It's those blasts, the website is clearly an important vehicle, but now she has her newsletter. So we'll just want to document kind of all of those different avenues of our communication. But then I think this is also just a broader discussion. And I look forward to hearing everybody, because you've all have a lot of experience in the town of just how what should our engagement strategy look like in terms of what's the best way to reach people? Where have you had success before in working groups that you've been on to get people to attend and participate? But I will work with her and start to gather some feedback from her as well of the kind of the best practice ideas, and then I'm happy to start drafting something once I hear also what you all think too.
I have a question for you. So if, for example, the newsletter, right, which goes out to about 3,000 Needham residents right now.
Yeah.
And so can you integrate what we would call a climate corner, which would be a sort of piece that would be sort of an ongoing piece that would sort of articulate this process as it moves forward? Is that something that we could expose people to on a regular basis? And could that climate corner issue be incorporated into other media approaches so that if the agenda keeps being exposed to everyone with whatever venue you use? And so essentially each venue that you approach will essentially have the same content and information, so that whoever we reach will be getting the same information. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and likely pointing that back to our website, right, for the greater info, more detail. I like that.
I like the idea of the climate corner, especially if in some of the media, we can make that interactive so that if we're standing in the corner talking about climate, people can talk back to us.
Yeah.
And then I think in an ideal world, we would generate feedback and discussion.
There are a lot of logistical things associated with multiple committees and things like that. We have to think about that as well.
Yeah.
Because if you're trying to reach out, then the owl has to be working, the presentations have to be set up, and then you need to get the word out with enough time to. So there's a lot of logistics behind that.
Yeah.
I know when we were going through the facilities master plan in
Yeah.
2014, there was a very large, we always met up in Powers Hall, and every single department and every single chair of every single committee came together as we were going through the initial brainstorming process. And it was broadcast.
Yeah.
So there was participation, and I think people could even handwrite stuff. But we still, we didn't gather the broadness that you're trying to achieve through that process.
Outside of the town staff. And
Right.
yeah. That's actually something, maybe just level this up a little bit, because we're kind of getting a little into the mechanics and logistics. If we think about this in terms of the calendar, what should we be doing this summer, like maybe on a quarterly basis for the next 2 years? What are the key messages we want to get out? Who do we want to get them out to what end? And not just that direction, the other direction, right? So when do we need to solicit feedback? Who are we soliciting feedback from, for what purpose? I feel like that sort of structure might help us a little bit in terms of thinking more about what are the avenues we need to use, what are the technology techniques that we need to use in order to accomplish those goals. So maybe start to kind of make it easier to start, like, who are the key stakeholders that we need to engage? And then when do we want, in stakeholder groups, do we need to engage, and when? And for what purpose?
What I think will be interesting to you guys is that as we're going through this process with the engagement of different parts of the town, and engagement, I mean, the town government itself, with different people, the homeowners and so forth, we're actually going to see as we're going through this. My guess is we're going to see change as we're coming along. You know, where we're talking about something that we want to do as part of the climate action, a goal as what we're presenting to the town in a year and a half, whenever it is. There's a very good chance we'll see some changes going on as we're going through the process already.
Yeah.
I think that I'm excited about that. That would be pretty cool. Some of the stuff is doing, some of the stuff will happen, some of the stuff can't happen, but it'll be pretty cool to see what will happen, what does happen as we're engaging and moving along. One thing that I'm always fearful of, and with politics in general, it's very easy to be fearful of it, because with politicians, they're always worried about the next election cycle. That's their concern. Next election cycle, raise the money. What do I have to do to stay in office, type of thing? Where I think our goal is not what do we have to do to stay in office? What do we have to do to get to where we need to be down the line? So we're not, you know, so we can have our steps, some are a little bit more incremental, one way or another, they're going to be incremental steps. So I think I'm really excited. It's going to be pretty cool to see what happens as we're moving along in this process, as we're engaging, as we're getting people excited. That's going to be pretty cool to see that.
So groups that have been identified already, I think town meeting is one sort of stakeholder group, which is FinCom. Obviously, the select board.
Okay, I was like, I do that one, that one.
There's let's say department heads generally.
Yeah, I think you could break DPW down into its different categories.
Yeah.
I think also schools.
Schools is probably its own special, right?
Yeah.
What about the Chamber of Commerce?
Yep, chamber.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that also the Needham, the Charles River?
It's the Charles River. It's the Charles River.
N2 squared and.
That meeting is gone, as Josh wrote about that.
It's now,
Yeah,
it's now the Charles River Chamber.
Chamber of Commerce.
Water down in Wilson.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wellesley, Newton, and
Homeowners.
Waterton.
right.
Is the homeowners association needed?
No, just
No.
general.
General, well, I mean, you've got
We should probably say homeowners and renters.
residents.
Would you include realtors?
I mean, that's
They're
a
just selling it.
Yeah.
Realtors and builders are a separate subset, but they are a factor.
Yeah, I would put realtors and builders in this, builders and developers.
And the
houses of worship.
Yes, houses of
Yeah,
worship.
definitely builders. I'm talking to a builder right now, where we were doing some
Ah.
net zero homes, so yeah, definitely builders.
And then what about the
Zoning.
new Needham Association?
I'm sorry.
zoning.
Zoning board. Zoning.
Eversource.
Planning.
The zoning board of appeals.
So
Yeah, well, I mean.
Just planning board.
here
or-
it's-
Yeah.
Planning.
Well, it's Eversource and the oil companies, but.
Oh, building is.
No, no.
Yeah. So the building inspector would be part of the DRT.
Oh,
Yeah, PTOs,
so,
schools, I mean, that's the.
community organizations, community organizations generally. Don't know how granular we want to go on that.
I'm just trying to capture, as many residents and young families as possible as well. I wonder if you'll be able to engage younger people more than older people. I don't mean to discriminate in any way, but I'm just wondering if that's the reality of it. So I don't know.
There,
So whenever I go to a climate activist meeting, it's usually the older people that show up.
but there is a, the Needham, the High School Environmental Club, which kind of waxes and wanes. but
Hmm.
It's definitely something you see from other towns' models that engaging.
Well, we have a list of
That
houses.
list that you were sharing from Wells, is it from Wellesley? I think we could, there's probably a Needham equivalent to almost all of those, right?
Yeah,
Mm.
Yeah,
the housing authority is another one,
housing authority is another one.
because they're going back for CPC funding on future projects, and certainly any grant funding they can get for energy improvement is going to be huge for them.
So this is a good starting list, and I think going through that Wellesley list might be helpful as well. We might, we don't have a lot of time in this meeting, but maybe this is something Rachel, you and I could connect on offline, starting to think about these groups in bigger buckets. So there's some groups where we need their buy-in because there's work to do. There's, new zoning law that needs to be passed, or there's new sustainability guidelines for public buildings. Right? So there's that sort of stakeholder engagement. There's people whose votes we need in order to get funding to do those things, which would be like town meeting. And then there's groups where we need their buy-in to electrify their homes and businesses and switch to electric vehicles. And that's probably another set of stakeholders, right? So it'd be useful to start to bucket them and start thinking in terms of our climate action plan, our calendar. When do we want to start to bring these stakeholder groups into the process to help us have a better output at the end, but also to help us activate individuals at the right time. The example I would give here is that if we're going to do the community electricity aggregation warrant in the fall, we probably want to be thinking about town meeting outreach sometime after it's adopted as a goal from the select board and before town meeting, so that we get that warrant article passed. And who do we need beyond town meeting to get involved with that? So that might be the external groups, homeowners buildings as well. So if we can think of that, level of granularity on an engagement plan, it'll help us not boil the ocean. We're
And I
not gonna-
think to Artie's point before, as we go along, we should just have discipline within our group that as we take an action or make a decision or move something forward, that we take a couple minutes during that time to say, who do we need to tell? What do we need to tell? When do we need to tell them? And just kind of build that into the way our group, moves forward.
So really our,
'Cause
whatever.
it's
our-
gonna change. We're not gonna be able to anticipate, at what point the housing authority should be brought in. It's really gonna be dependent on a lot of, right? So that just has to be kind of built into the way we.
That's a
We
great
were.
suggestion. Can you help keep us honest on that?
Yes. Yeah.
One question I
Well,
have.
the first reach out might be, these are our preliminary goals. What are your goals?
Yeah.
Because some of these groups probably have been talking about it for quite a long time. And if you look at the population within Needham, I don't know what percentage is in multi-housing, what the age of the various houses are. That could be an entire research, summer research in and of itself. But I know what Concord has tried to do is they have energy coaches. And so you need to think both about the carrot and the stick. And most people respond favorably when you say, these grant funds are going to run out. If you don't go after it now, now's the time to do it. And it'll save you X number of dollars. And I think Green Needham has been a huge factor, a huge motivator in that to date with the solar program and other.
And then we actually have a retired energy engineer who's,
Ed Quinlan is
as
great.
Quinlan is
Yeah.
coaching.
Yeah, so, so that's a very helpful outcome, I think, or identifying those people. And likewise, the college, I'm sure Olin has a plan. And it'd be interesting to find out what their plan is, and they have ideas how to spread that throughout the community.
And one thing I don't know, don't know what we can or can't do. So, we have our subgroups and so forth. We are this is technically a town committee. So the subgroups are technically town committee subgroups. So if we're having a meeting, and I've certainly seen the planning board meetings on just Zoom without the owl, so we can have our meetings via Zoom, correct?
I believe that's what we're going to be required.
What's that?
Well, I think
If they're
we're moving
public
in
meetings.
person.
Well, the in-person has been pushed back to like 2023, where it has to be in person.
Not yet.
Yeah, so it's to somewhere next year. Well,
It's expiring in July 15th,
but it's scheduled, but it looks like it's scheduled to be pushed back to next year.
potentially.
So when we have our Zoom meetings, we can have hybrid, whatever we have.
Yeah.
I mean, but we don't have to, we can have Zoom meetings. There's no prerequisites. There's nothing that says we can't have Zoom meetings, correct?
What I don't know is whether the subcommittees are technically public bodies and therefore having to go through all the notification processes that Catherine does, posting it. And I don't know whether the subcommittees fall within that category. This committee certainly does.
I've never heard that.
Maybe why they seem to be referred to as working groups rather
Working
than
groups.
subcommittee.
Oh,
And
there
that
you
may
go.
make
Yeah,
a big
and
difference.
as long as there are
Yeah.
no more than two of any of this group in any one meeting, then you should be okay.
You're right, because in the planning board, they have the housing working group.
Yes, I've seen those notices come through, though, and they're posting, but they might be on Zoom.
Okay, well, I know they've definitely been having. Zoom
We should follow up with
Be with
town
Kate,
council.
town council.
I mean, the planning board meetings have been
I
Zoom
can ask
meetings,
for
they
some
haven't been.
more
Right,
as
yes.
well.
Great.
Very important point, though, as we're going through our lists of who we'd like to invite into groups. Remember, the other thing is to not create a quorum from another committee. So,
Oh, yeah, right.
for example.
Well, not to create a quorum from this committee.
Well,
Or from
any-
other
any
committees.
committee. So if we're bringing somebody in, somebody else from the plan.
Oh, yeah,
right,
yeah.
We wouldn't want.
Well, we
them
can't
to
have three planning board members there.
we
Yeah.
wouldn't
Yes,
want
yes,
that.
yes, yes.
So. Good. So one last just point about engagement. I think Hank had a good point about Green Needham's reach and expertise in this area. Two things. One, as we're working through engagement, we can always think about them as an extension of town efforts. They're both on Green Needham, and I think speaking very cavalierly, pretty sure that we could get the Green Needham to amplify whatever we're doing, and even potentially help with some of the logistics. The second thing is as you're thinking about the people that you'd like on your working groups, they also know a lot of people. And so you can always reach out to us and say, hey, do you know anybody who has expertise in these areas?
Yeah.
And hopefully we might be able to connect.
I mean, it'd be great if you could get one additional Green Needham person on each one of the subcommittees.
We can certainly
Thank you, John.
float it.
So Green Needham people don't count as like part of a town.
They're just
No,
people.
no.
They're just people.
They're volunteers.
Would speaking of legal issues, and maybe this is another question for council, I assume that if we want somebody, let's say there's a person who is active, well, even, in terms of conflict of interest, if I sell and install electric vehicle chargers, on the one hand, I'd be a great resource for the transportation committee. On the other hand, does that person, does the town conflict of interest,
Yeah.
it's simply a matter of applying that and saying, well,
Or they have to disclose.
yeah,
I
and
just say, I am a contractor, I do this.
Right.
But they have some technical
Right.
expertise that like.
I think in-
I can also ask them, but I can't imagine if we're
It wouldn't
including
automatic-
realtors as a subgroup,
Yeah.
that wouldn't be any different.
Yeah. I remember when we were doing the solar energy exploratory committee for the RTS, there were members who had very specific expertise. One member had to step off when we were doing the final selection because she was counsel to one of the companies that was making a
Oh,
submittal.
yeah.
And but was very, very much engaged all the way through and very helpful to have that knowledge base.
Okay. so it doesn't,
It's not an automatic.
right,
And there's no town funding that's going toward
Recommendation.
their recommendations at this point.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing that I saw in Wellesley is they do mention that it's a framework plan only.
Right.
So when we get to a plan, it's really the beginning. And it's a working document. Because, and that also helps achieve the short time frame that you're
Right.
talking about.
Right.
And I think the other question that'll come to the committee, first, there's funding potentially for a consultant. But then is there a long-term position, new position within the town? And is that necessary?
I already have that drafted.
You do, okay.
It was drafted last year as this is probably gonna come up sometime in the future, just start thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, good point about the framework agreements and LG. Mary Beth had mentioned that they're taking the plan and then they're taking specific pieces of it and say, 2022, we need to do an implementation blueprint for this proposed action.
Yeah.
And then they go through the RFP process, they distill it down into, phases and it's much more detailed than they would ever want to get to in the plan.
Right.
the climate action plan. So we should be definitely at that level, not at the implementation level.
And I think that's a helpful point to make as we spread the word. It's the beginning of the process.
The beginning of the process. They'll stretch out to 2050.
Right. And I think the other lessons that I've learned, having seen other communities go through it, is you help people take one step at a time. It's not as though everybody can do everything immediately, but what are the trigger points where they can do things? When you're changing your furnace out and it's 20 years old, that's the time to think about electrification. When you're buying a new car, that's the time to understand what the tax credits are and what the charging requirements are, and having a coach, or there is that other group, the state group. I don't know if that's what.
The Drive Green group. or-
Drive
Yes.
Green. And so we will be doing, eventually sponsoring some of those ourselves, but there are other ones that are, I think there's another one happening this month as a webinar. I can send that to folks if they're interested. But those would be the kind of things, maybe you already post on the Green Needham.
Term out.
Some, yeah,
Yeah.
we have a calendar of those.
Not just to it, but really outreach. Yeah.
I think it's about 2 to 3
2 to
thousand.
3,000, I mean, there's,
So similar to the newsletter,
yeah,
and it might be overlap.
But there's probably some overlap. But it's taken years for us to generate a constituency that's very interested in green issues.
And that's a huge database. And
yeah, and we do the analytics, so as far as who's clicking, opening, you know, that whole.
oh, right.
It is done.
So I'm going to move us forward a little bit in our agenda here so that we have time for Andy's presentation on the Charles River Pump Station. So maybe we can do this relatively quickly, just starting to refine our ask for the town meeting for the fall. So one of them, I think, is going to come from the select board specifically, and that's the CEA. I don't believe any of our recommendations that are going to select board have a town meeting component to them. I can't recall. Off the top of my head.
No, I mean. Was it funding? Well, there was a funding request
That's the other piece.
for the tightening up the greenhouse gas inventory, which I believe there was a question whether the town could even do that. And,
That's where we need a consultant.
and as an alternate, right, because it'd be 3,000 to 5,000 from what.
Yeah, I think Kate said she was going to look to see if there was budget because that was less than what she had expected it to be. She was going to go, we're ready to hear back.
Yeah, okay. And as an alternate, Green Needham could pay for it just to, whether making a grant or doing somehow to move it along so that it wasn't a town meeting ask. If it's, you know, in that $3,000 to $5,000 range.
So I think that that's probably something we'll hopefully get an answer to at the chairs meeting.
Yeah, and do you think that you need a consultant to help you lead through the second half of this process?
That's the other question. I think when we get to our working groups, the working groups will have to be going through a certain process, and the expectation is we wouldn't be able to have a consultant on staff hired up and ready to help the working groups. But when the working groups produce their outputs, potentially we could have a consultant who could help us consolidate that, refine that, and then put the presentation on top of it, like how to make it into an attractive document that's easy for others to understand. And so that's probably the other big bucket that we might want to ask for the fall.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Wellesley and elsewhere, they've acted as the facilitator and kind of leader of the process, which has been helpful for them. And it, you know, in my opinion, if you have to wait for funding to a special town meeting, before you can really initiate that process and bring that person on board, that might facilitate each of you working group leaders. But it's, you know, that I think is up to you.
I think we're actually moving faster than that process would allow.
Yeah.
So if you needed a consultant to shepherd you through the working groups, we have it by now, because we're gonna be organizing our working group activity really soon.
Yeah.
And there's no way that you'll get a consultant by then, right?
No,
No,
Right.
no.
but I do think that, I mean, one of the things when we were putting this timeline together, one of the things I was thinking was if we have a consultant who is taking the output of the working
Yes.
groups and kind of standardizing things and then helping us bring it to the broader constituencies.
Mhm.
That's something that an outside perspective would be really helpful to have. And if we put an ask together for the fall town meeting, then it's something where a scope and RFP could be put in place and have somebody lined up to start at the beginning of 2023, hopefully, so that if we make the ask this fall, then they could help us take
Take the raw.
take the the raw materials and build this framework in a coherent way and help us communicate it and get feedback from the broader
So
town.
is the ask in August for just the energy assessment, or is the ask for the energy assessment and then the consultant?
So those are, I think those are separate.
They're separate.
I know they're separate,
So
so
greenhouse,
we're not gonna bring that up.
I don't think that's a town warrant, town meeting warrant. So I think that the pivot is, can Kate find it in her current budget to pay for it? If not, we bring it to Green Needham and see if they could either loan it to the town or fund it. The separate is the consultant and what they will do. I agree with you that they're probably, because you have to wait for special town meeting to get approval. Then you'd have to develop an RFP, then you'd have to go through the whole process, then you'd have to bring them on board. You're probably not until, before January. So that would essentially say, let's stop our activity for 6 months. It doesn't feel like a good use of this committee's charge. The other thing is, having talked to Mary Beth and others, the consultants, the value that they brought were the framework, which we've effectively adopted already. Okay, we've got a bit of a framework that Wellesley went through, and that's hopefully something we can self-organize on. And then the output, like how do they present the output in a way that's digestible for different constituencies, and things like dashboards, right? So I know the consultant Wellesley helped develop a dashboard specifically around the greenhouse gas output for the town. That could be part of the RFP.
Yeah.
We want somebody to both help publish the plan, finalize and publish the plan, and then develop a dashboard that the town can use to communicate its progress.
Yeah, it's really, I think a question of somebody who can communicate the plan and develop a strategy for two-way communication as we take our raw material.
Right.
And we can, if we agree this is a general direction that we might want a consultant for, we could hone in on the specific ask over the next few weeks.
Yeah, well, if you could define, you need to define the scope,
Yes.
and the Director of Finance begins to put together any of the warrant articles for fall town meeting starting in August. And what was that other sequence we talked about this morning? So there are steps along the way, and it needs to be approved by select board before it can go to town meeting.
So we would need a scope and a rough budget number by our next meeting,
Yeah.
August 15th.
I don't know, Paul, you at one point were gonna try to get a few other sustainability coordinators to tell us what consultant budgets they use.
Yeah, I think I sent you
You sent me a
a
few.
range
Yeah.
of the three, which were broad.
Yep.
I'll review those.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, that's a good question. Are we nibbling around a sustainability coordinator? Not with this.
Not with this.
Yeah.
Not with this.
Because the towns who have done this already have a sustainability
Yeah.
coordinator and they still outsourced it.
Yeah. In large part, this committee is playing the role of the sustainability coordinator. And what we're talking about for the consultant would be to help us provide the polish final plan should have in terms of it's a visual presentation, it's writing. Unless this group wants to be writing a 20-30 page document and producing graphs and charts and pictures and images.
Yeah, marketing.
I used to be, no longer.
And some of these consultants worked with the people who interacted with the communications and media elements of their community to get the word out, right? So
Right.
they help.
There's some options there as well.
And Paul, sometimes the RFQs from other towns are posted on their website,
Yes.
so those would be useful.
So we have some of those in
I
the.
think I did get some, yeah, and I'll look again.
So in the interest of time, and since Paul, you've already done a little bit of work on this, could I ask you to take the lead on helping us refine what the ask would be for a consultant? And you could work with me and Nick over the next few weeks.
So we are going to bring up the issue of the energy assessment. When you meet in August.
Yes.
Okay. Two things, we're gonna bring up, two asks.
There's 3 asks total. So one is the greenhouse gas and inventory finalizing that. That's something we hope we can just do from budget. Or do we need them?
Right.
Second is, there are a set of goals that we've asked for, but the principal one was the community electricity aggregation.
Yes.
So that would be a warrant article. And then third would be a consultant to help finalize the climate action plan in Q1 or H1 2023. In addition to potentially other activities around communication of the said plan and a dashboard potentially for the town.
Those are the three.
I do want to ask one other question though. Rachel, do you have any thoughts around whether or not we need any funding to support outreach?
I think it's too early to say. I don't have a recommendation yet. I mean, I think when you talked about the like synthesizing the work group feedback and that there could be an element there of helping us to craft, presentations that we could use to share with the community, executive summaries. And so maybe there's a component there that we can kind of couple together.
Idea. So rather than have it be in a separate ask, it would be included in the consultant RFP.
I think so, right? Helping us with socializing and sharing with our community stakeholders could just be part of that ask.
So since we need to move on to Andy's, over the next few weeks, sounds like Paul, you're gonna drive the ask for the consultant. You can reach out to Nick or I for some help.
There's a slideshow on here.
And then just keep in mind the potential outreach.
When is it?
August
Haven't
17th.
lost power.
So I think what
Did
we
you
should
print
try
out
to get
anything?
for the next meeting is a final ask
I only printed out one
that we
copy.
would be able to transmit to the select.
And our August meeting is when?
August
Do you know when
13th.
It's the one called,
We don't have it scheduled yet. Oh, yeah,
Now, our meeting is on August 15th.
ours is 15th. Yeah. Oh, I wrote that. Sorry, it is August.
look under today's date,
Our meetings are August 15th. The one with
CAPC
Cheryl is
7.
not scheduled
The
yet, but we're
Charles
trying to
River Water
schedule
Treatment
before.
Plant.
Yep, and there's a 2, there's one
Why
which
would
is
it
the
be
2.
before if we're gonna finalize our asks on the 15th? Should it be?
Is it that one?
Should be that one, yeah.
one?
Guys, hang on just a sec. Sorry, getting a little confused with multiple conversations. Sorry.
So that you're gonna take our asks with
So-
the estimates to that committee, or to that group, correct? In August.
But the earlier select board meeting is really for the plan.
Oh, fine.
Yeah, the high level plan, yeah, just to get sign off on the plan.
You might get feedback from Kate about that, yes.
Awesome.
My preliminary discussion with her today is getting a full-time sustainability coordinator, is at least a year, maybe 2 years
Yeah.
away,
Oh, yeah.
but a consultant might be possible.
Excellent. All right. So we now have Andy, who's done some research, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Is there a way to click through the slides or is it just? on the-
You'll just have to tell me.
Okay. So this is research into siting a solar array at the Charles River Water Treatment Plant site, which is in the southwest of town at 914 Charles River Street. Yeah. All right, so a summary was in 2015, the treatment plant was the second largest or the second highest municipal user of energy in town. And it continues to consume large amounts of energy at 1.6 million kilowatt hours per year. And this concept is to remove part of the forest at the site on the 41-acre site in order to create an array large enough to generate enough electricity to equal the consumption of the building, which would create a net zero building with respect to electricity, and to put flowering plants underneath the solar array in what's called pollinator-friendly solar arrays. This has been done in other places in Massachusetts, and UMass Amherst has a certification program for sites to do this. We also would plan to maintain all of the necessary setbacks, including the scenic road, as Charles River Street is a scenic road, and that comes with its own stipulations. This is just a graph of the fiscal year 2022 consumption. It's about the same as it was in 2015, when it was the second highest energy user after the high school. So it's a site which is important in its own right for the water supply, but also uses a lot of energy and could be a site where we expand the resiliency and allow for more renewable energy in town. So the forest on the site is made up of different stands. 3 of these stands are dominated by red pine trees. And these were planted in the 1930s, according to a 2005 report that we had done by a forester. According to this forester, storm damage and invasive species caused the red pine to be harmed and suffering from that. And today, Edward Olson says that some of the trees are diseased in addition to being damaged from storms and invasive species. We visited the site on July 6th, and along fire access roads, which crisscross through the site, there you can see there's a lot of invasive species that dominate trees. There are some standing dead trees, and there are thick vines near the access roads. We didn't know what percent of trees were damaged, what percent were dead on site, but it was extensive along the pathways. Benjamin Forestry Services in 2005 ended up saying that these red pine stands could be converted into white pine stands through either clear cutting or shelter wood, which would be removing every 4th row because the red pine were in such a bad condition. All right, so this is he made a map, Mr. Benjamin, and I highlighted stand 7 and 10, which is where we would primarily cite this proposed concept. Stand 7 is near the water treatment plant building. To the west, there's a swale in between them, which is a low area with water. So there's a stream running down it. And then stand 10 is to the east. That's a much larger area. And those are both red pine stands dominated by red pine trees.
It's on mine as different.
I did again. Oh, that's really weird.
Our presentation.
I'm glad you're seeing it too. I was like, what?
It went red on your left.
Oh,
Let me share. There we go. I don't know.
So Ben Anderson from the GIS department created this conceptual layout. This is sort of the maximum area we could put solar panels in. There are 4,950 panels in this, in a total area of 7 acres here. You can see we've done a lot of setbacks as part of this conceptual image. One area is near the water treatment plant building, then the swale is in between, and then there's another area with a fire access road down the middle with more panels. This area has setbacks for Charles River Street, 100 feet from the street to comply with the scenic road regulations, 200 feet from rivers and streams, including the swale and Charles River, 100 feet from wetlands, which are near the river, and 50 feet in the east, west, and south of the areas to account for shading, because unlike the RTS, this isn't on a landfill. There are trees all around and they'll shade the closest panels. We want to have inverters and a battery on site to increase the resilience of the building by having a battery backup. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory has a quick calculator tool that allows you to put in some statistics about a proposed array and have an estimated generation. With 400-watt panels, this many panels would produce more than the treatment plant consumed. And with 500-watt panels, it would be even more. So the thinking is we wouldn't need to have that much. And indeed, with 500-watt panels, the building consumption could be equaled with half that number of panels. So the project size in the last image could be reduced to not displace that many trees as was pictured. Pollinator-friendly solar means that a meadow is planted under the solar array. As you can see in this picture from Arnold Arboretum, where they did this, is in a project called the Well Hill Solar Array. It's a diverse set of common native plants that provides nectar to bees and other pollinators. And this allows for more habitat to be created. The Well Hill Solar Array had more space between rows, 8 feet, which is larger space than other arrays. So that was accounted into the project plan by Ben Anderson. Some disadvantages of this concept are that Benjamin Forestry Services wished for there to be white pine trees where the red pines were. And clearly this would be putting a solar array here. While it isn't white pine trees, it does have its own renewable energy. There would also need to be a change in bylaw for zoning, because right now the only place where a large solar array can be sited is the RTS. So it would need to be applied. This isn't specific to just this site. Any large solar array that we wanted to put in would have to be extended because it only applies to the RTS right now. And of course, displacing or removing trees would result in habitat loss and forest carbon loss from the above ground biomass. There would also maybe be public discontent from people on Charles River Street. Maybe people would think it was strange for the Climate Action Committee to propose this with cutting down trees, even if it results in more solar energy. There might be a disconnect that originates from that. And the advantages of this are to increase renewable energy in town. If a battery backup was used, it could increase the resilience of the water treatment plant because more electricity is being generated on site, and it could rely on this in times the grid was down. It is compliant with setback requirements, and there's enough space for this, even with 200 feet from every river. So staying outside of the buffer zone areas with wetlands and rivers. It would create more habitat to align with examples from Arnold Arboretum. And there are also a certification process from UMass that provides sample seed mixes. The red pine forest areas, which are currently under maintenance because of invasive species and storm damage, would be mitigated. In addition, there are fire access roads that already exist on site that could be used for construction vehicles were gravel to be placed on top of them. And these gravel roads could maintain the water infiltration that already exists on site, where erosion controls included. Around the perimeter of the array, trees could be replanted as saplings in order to increase the habitat diversity for birds and lower the tree height for shading around the array.
Oh, phew, I just got the low battery notice. So that's
Andy,
good.
can I ask you a question?
That's a great-
Yeah, sure.
Excellent. Is there a way to calculate the gains or carbon yield that offset the cutting of the trees? As you mentioned, in all society, in all different communities, the cutting of a tree is seen as like a completely opposite approach to environmentalism, right? So is there a way to calculate that, to give that information to people before they panic about the fact that we might cut down the tree?
Yeah, there is a way to calculate the above ground carbon from a tree, which uses the diameter base height of the tree. And I think there's a ratio which uses the below ground biomass. So you can, if one were to do a experiment with different plots, I think it could be done to to see how much carbon would be lost, and then convert that into how much carbon is being mitigated by the solar array, in order to create a comparison. But right now, I can't say.
I just see that as an important piece of communication information for people.
Yeah, definitely.
It's interesting that, that was great, especially looking at the diseased trees and seeing what I assume is bittersweet
Mhm.
suffocating those trees. And,
Yep.
you know, so when we think, or even looking at the standard calculators, well, the production from those dying trees or choke trees is much, you know, in terms of the photosynthesis that they're.
Yeah, I don't know how to calculate the
that's what-
vines.
Yeah,
Because they really are the dominant species.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's some trees that have 3 different vines on them, and they are growing 100 feet tall.
And they,
And
they'll choke the trees.
they have been choking the trees.
yeah, that forest has been dying for a while.
So are there any concerns about placing a solar array that close to a wetlands in terms of, 100-year floods, 1,000-year flood, thinking about resilience?
What's the elevation change?
Um,
The elevation.
Yeah, the areas we're looking at are probably equal, they're plateaus.
Yeah.
And they're the highest elevations within the site. It's a relatively flat site. And I believe that being 200 feet out of the riverfront, that they are also out of the flood zone. The design would lift up the lowest point of the panels to be about 4 feet off the ground,
Yeah.
and the high point maybe 8 feet off the ground, with the intent to allow the pollinator garden to grow. And also it allows for access for mowing and other things.
That's a really great point to, when you're talking about the pollinator friendly, because I think of ground mount systems and I think of the things that are
Yeah.
a foot off the ground, and that becomes a much airier space. And
Yeah, I think a close-up photo of one of there would be good.
They can also be bifacial panels, even though there isn't a lot of, forget the term right now, reflective aspect to it.
Uh-huh.
But bifacial also has a little bit of translucency to it. Sometimes there can be translucent, but there can be some bounce back of the energy coming off of that, because depending on the height of what's below it, there's an awful lot of energy coming back in the back of the panels, awful lot of energy coming back.
Another question I have is, has anyone done a study to find out if there's any energy consumption in the water pump that could be reduced, either by modernizing equipment or reducing leaks in the system, that might be able to allow us to go to an even smaller PV array?
Yeah, I had heard about the leaks you mentioned in a meeting we had a couple weeks ago. And I think I mentioned the leaks, but I don't know if engineering said something about they have a number related to that.
They know the number of gallons that aren't accounted for. They pump a certain amount of water and they bill out another amount of water. What they don't know is how many meters are broken. No, and there are some people that refuse access to their houses, so they can't change out 20-year-old meters. And they face a lot of issues like that. They do meter all of the town buildings, so they know the quantity, although they don't bill themselves. The town doesn't bill itself. They're constantly going through and looking at the oldest pipes and going through replacement. And Cecilia, you may know more about that program than I. But that's one of the tasks that they are constantly looking at.
It would be great if we could get a number that represented what we thought we could reduce in energy consumption before sizing a system that would remove trees permanently.
Yeah, the strategy right now, their energy reduction strategy, is to pump at night as much as possible into the well, into the water towers, and then use that to supercharge the system during the day. So they're buying low cost energy and they're using the kinetic, what do you call it, energy, the stored energy, potential energy to supplement. And then during the peak periods, they do have to tie into the MWRA supply during the summer. But those are all, those are all details that would need to come out with one of the, the focus groups.
Yeah.
The optics of tree cutting.
Yeah.
Are a huge issue for a subset of people who won't get the trade-off issue.
Yeah.
And dealing with that up front to prevent that from becoming the dominant
Yeah.
narrative is gonna be very important in this project.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Everyone's going around, dealing with this around the country right now.
Yeah.
I do know the other thing we have, it doesn't address the pumping, the energy consumption from pumping, but just the energy consumption from the HVAC system inside the building. We're looking at upgrading all of those systems in that building in particular, because it's on top of being inconvenient, it's also inefficient at this point. So that is one thing that now with this going forward, we'll be looking at more energy efficient options as well.
I think
Probably.
one other question that might come to you is, if the town were to adopt a CEA and all of our electricity was green, what would the additional benefit be of cutting trees down to put a solar PV array in?
Well,
I think this,
it's a pretty big benefit.
Big
in
benefit.
my
We need
regard.
we need to articulate.
Articulate
Yes.
that, yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's pretty big
Because if they
benefit.
say, well, you're not replacing fossil fuels anymore, because we're not bringing fossil fuels.
Well, I mean, when we do that, to some degree, we're buying a carbon offset to some degree. It's not exactly like
It
that,
might
but
be
it's,
that.
it's
And you
green
also
energy
create-
from 200 miles away or
Right,
something.
and create resilience locally,
Yeah, yeah.
which is another,
Yeah.
part of this equation, which
Yeah.
is, how you gather energy, what can you do locally for yourself? So that's not insignificant.
And there is income.
There's
market.
income
Oh, yeah.
potential, there's potential to do a power purchase agreement as opposed to
Mhm.
buy it out.
Mhm.
And Eversource, if we have batteries, and the batteries that we're talking about are the size of a shipping
Oh,
container.
they're big, yeah, they're huge.
But they provide a peak shaving for the facility and also can be money generators for the town.
some very good incentives on your add-ins.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, commercial scale.
Your
needed.
water towers are batteries.
They are,
Yeah.
basically. I asked the question, could we generate power? And the answer I got was, well, then you need a certain constant flow, which you don't necessarily have during the day. And the latent energy you're taking out by generating power from it would be relatively small in comparison to the need to power, charge the system.
I think we talked briefly about this, and that is the only way the grid is actually going to be green is by storage. It can't happen any other way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so by us being proactive and looking at this as being energy storage as part of the component, that's a big plus, big positive. And by, as you're saying, getting ahead of the curve, I mean, it's very greatly a diseased forest. I don't want to cut down any trees, even if it's the middle of a forest with invasive species growing on them. I don't necessarily want to cut that down, but it is a diseased tree, an invasive tree. And there's a limited value to that, environmental value to that tree standing amongst dead trees and so forth. So I think there's a lot of benefit, but again, we have to show the numbers. What does that mean? One minor thing I have, and that is, you're talking about the setbacks. The minor details have to be fixed ahead, and that is a 50-foot setback is not a very big setback on a ground mount.
Mhm.
When you have a 100-foot tree, a 50-foot setback is pretty minor.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of shading going on there, so that would have to be like. But if we have to have a smaller system, it'd be easier to have a bigger setback. But either way, that's a bigger setback is probably needed. Probably at least 100 feet. And my apologies.
Yeah.
The effect, the reflective effect is the albedo effect. It's albedo.
Yeah.
It's the albedo effect.
So Andy and Hank, what are the next steps on this project for you? Is it?
I think that with the aerial photos, if we could identify the most impacted zones within those forests, So Ben might be able to, from the aerial photograph, say, this is where the worst wind damage is. We're going to focus on those, and we're going to reduce the footprint by 50%. We're going to do the setbacks at 100 yards, and we're
100 yards,
100 feet. I'm sorry, 100
At
feet.
least the height of the tree.
But we're also going to look to replanting that within that 100 feet, lower species that have a greater diversity of fruits,
Yeah.
other than pollinators.
It would also add to the screening to charge
Yeah.
the street.
Yeah,
And I think that'd be a way to pitch this, is to say, the red pine forest is dead, it's dying, you need to replace it. We need a buffer zone that's green along Charles River Street. That should keep a lot of butters and neighbors happy. And then you say you're scaling the project.
okay.
Well, thank you, Andy.
That was
Yeah,
awesome.
that was great.
That was really good.
That was really good.
Thanks.
Very well done. So we could review the actions, or we could wait for the minutes. But I think the key, let me just go through the key actions that I think we've got. Nick and I have a memo that we need to send to the select board with the recommendations for select board goals. So we're sending that off to the chairs in the next week or two. We need to set up a meeting with the chairs as well in early August. Paul, you were going to take the consultant ask, drive that a little bit. We do have a list of potential chairs for each of the working groups, and each of those is going to go through the list from Wellesley and try to come up with their local list of at least titles or personas that you need on your boards, and have that ready for our next meeting as well. And then we'll also be meeting with, when we meet with the chairs, we'll try to finalize what's happening with the greenhouse gas emissions. Finalizing the greenhouse gas emissions.
The other item that came up, Stephen, is just with this PRT meeting.
Yes,
I'll be presenting the revised deck on the 26th.
so I need to revise that deck with you in advance of that meeting.
Yeah,
so
we
it's
can-
ready to go.
Is that the one where we're thinking of a 2-page summary?
The 2-page summary is more like
The public.
the public, when we get to the climate action plan, what's the 1 or 2 pager? So did I miss any key actions? Anybody have another one that? Does anybody have an action that I didn't mention? I put it that way.
I should just inform you that we have had preliminary discussions with planning. And one of Andy's next tasks is to look at zoning bylaw changes that other towns have enacted to enable solar, that other changes coming out of their climate action plan
That's
committees.
fantastic.
Yeah.
And
That's
one thing,
It's perfect.
Planning board, right?
planning board,
So you're meeting with the chair, Adam.
Lee Newman.
Okay,
Yeah, so we have monthly Zoom meetings with town engineer and the building inspector, building commissioner, and we talk about all the different projects that are going through planning.
Great.
And those, they ask, well, what's happening next? And I mentioned this committee and some of the asks that this committee will have to planning board. And the other thing Andy didn't mention was when we looked at this, if we take the large scale solar zoning that's currently in place for the RTS, and you just bring it over and it becomes an overlay for this, it's fully compliant as proposed. So the site is more than 20 acres. The coverage of the array is less than
50%,
15%,
50%.
less than 50%, right? The setback from the street is more than 100 feet. That might
I think it was 50.
50.
I think it does 50 feet.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it would be a simple one just to convert that to the overlay. And then the other question was canopy solar,
yeah.
and that's a big one.
We zone
that's a
that
huge
throughout the
point.
city.
Yeah.
Throughout the town.
You know, where and what are the ramifications and who's allowed to do it. And
It's a good project.
Talk to the fire chief.
It's a little,
So
it's a
Andy,
little,
you're
it's a
working on
little
that one as
baffling
well?
why we don't have.
The
that.
canopy solar.
Well, looking at other zoning bylaw changes and canopy solar would be one of those.
Okay, that's good.
Terrific.
So it's 10 past our adjournment. Do we have a motion? Motion to adjourn. Second.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Vote. All right, unanimous vote. Meeting adjourned.
I should also mention that both the school department